Who was Jesus Christ? It sounds like a pretty simple historical question, right? But depending on who you actually ask, you're going to get drastically different and honestly sometimes fiercely opposed answers. Ask a Christian and they're going to say he's the Son of God. Ask a Muslim, they'll tell you he was a highly revered, holy prophet. Talk to someone of the Jewish faith and you might hear he was a false messiah. And if you ask an atheist, well, they're probably going to point to peer-reviewed studies to argue he was either just an ordinary guy or maybe even entirely a psychological coping mechanism. It's wild to think about. This is a single question that has literally shaped human civilization as we know it, yet we just can't agree on the answer.
Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we are unpacking what we're just going to call the Jesus problem. Now, let me be clear right up front. We are not here to take a theological side or tell you what to believe. Not at all. Instead, we're taking a strictly objective look at the data, the historical methodology, and the genuinely fascinating sociological friction that this one figure causes. By digging into the source material, we're going to explore why humanity is so deeply divided on this, not just in faith, but in how we even define what's true.
So, to unpack this absolutely massive topic, we've broken this explainer down into 5 distinct parts. First up, the global divide. Second, science versus history. Third, absolute versus relative truth. Fourth, the life of Jesus. And finally, 3 ways to coexist.
All right, let's jump right into part 1, the global divide, and specifically, how humanity views miracles.
So, while almost all historians generally agree that a guy named Jesus did actually exist, the real debate globally centers on one crucial thing. Could he actually perform miracles? If we break down the world's population by where they stand on this, the data paints a really fascinating picture. You've got 34% of the world identifying as Christian, and they firmly believe he performed miracles. Then you have 25% who are Muslim, and while they don't view Jesus as the Son of God, they completely agree he performed miracles through divine power. On the flip side, we've got atheist and Jewish populations making up roughly 16% of the globe, and they believe he was definitively just a man. No magic, no miracles. And then we have the remaining 25%, which is made up of Hindus, Buddhists, and various folk religions. The source material actually playfully calls this group's view Schrodinger's miracle, because it's essentially a 50-50 split of believing and not believing at the exact same time, depending on nuanced theology, like maybe viewing him as a high-level monk or an avatar of a deity.
Now, what's really interesting about this breakdown is what happens when we consolidate those numbers. If we split that remaining 25% right down the middle, we arrive at a truly stunning mathematical conclusion. Roughly 75% of humanity, that is 3 out of every 4 people on planet Earth today, believe that a historical figure named Jesus actually performed supernatural miracles. I mean, wow.
Moving on to part 2, science versus history, or what we can call the methodology clash.
Look, in our modern world, we naturally want science to just step in and either confirm or deny what that 75% believes, right? We don't want to just rely on some majority rules diplomacy. But here is the massive clash in methodology. Science and history just do not play by the same rules. Think about it. Science requires repeatability. If you drop an apple, it falls. If you want to study it, you pick it up and drop it again and again. History, though? History is made up of one-shot events. As the source material jokingly points out, you can't exactly rewind time, hand Julius Caesar a GoPro and ask him to get stabbed 23 times again just so we can gather empirical data. It doesn't work like that. Instead, history is forced to rely on testimonies, ancient documents, and artifacts. And when those ancient documents claim supernatural events actually happened, well, we run smack into a major philosophical wall.
Which brings us to part 3, absolute versus relative truth and defining the friction.
It's exactly this philosophical framework that creates so much global friction when we try to interpret those ancient historical documents. So let's quickly define our terms. Absolute truth is the belief that a specific fact or reality is universally valid. Period. End of story. For example, for a devout Muslim, the Quran is the absolute truth. For a strict atheist, the unbreakable laws of nature and science are the absolute truth. Both of these groups hold on to their reality fiercely, and neither one believes their truth is just some casual opinion.
Now, contrast that with relative truth. This is the belief that truth is totally subjective. Your truth is your truth, my truth is my truth. In our modern society, people often claim to champion relative truth as a sort of diplomatic tool, mostly just to keep the peace and avoid messy arguments.
But the source analysis offers this wonderfully cynical yet highly accurate quote on this exact dynamic. It says, "Absolute and relative truth is simply a way to respectfully say you are wrong and I am right." Honestly, it hits the nail on the head.
The reality is that whole live and let live mentality completely falls apart the absolute second someone else's absolute truth starts affecting your everyday life. I mean, an atheist might claim all truth is relative, right up until a society tries to mandate Sunday church attendance, or dictate modest clothing laws, or legally require circumcision. Suddenly, that atheist truth becomes very absolute. You literally cannot force me to do that. When core beliefs clash with societal laws, friction is totally inevitable.
Let's get into part 4, the life of Jesus, a highly compressed 4-minute narrative.
Because listen, no single narrative has caused more of this exact type of global friction than the story of Jesus. So we're going to do a rapid-fire speed run of the biblical texts that shaped all these competing worldviews. The story kicks off in the 1st century Roman Empire, which, by the way, was a pretty brutal time, filled with heavy taxes and crucifixions. Around the year 4, Jesus is born to a virgin named Mary. Almost immediately, King Herod hears a new king has been born and orders a mass baby genocide. Horrific, right? This forces Jesus' family to flee to Egypt. After Herod dies, they eventually return. Fast forward to year 16, and we get this brief glimpse of a young 12-year-old Jesus debating seasoned Jewish theologists. Then the timeline jumps again to age 30, roughly year 34. Jesus is baptized in the Jordan River by his eccentric cousin, John the Baptist, before heading straight into the wilderness for 40 days to fast. And while he's out there, he is allegedly tempted directly by Satan.
After defeating that temptation, Jesus essentially goes viral. He handpicks 12 disciples and launches this massive public ministry. The texts claim he starts performing these astonishing miracles, feeding 5,000 people with just a few loaves of bread, walking on water, casting out demons, and healing the sick. The everyday crowds absolutely love him. But the strict, rule-following religious leaders of the day, the Pharisees, they completely despise him. Jesus is constantly breaking their rules, he's eating with outcasts, and he's publicly exposing their corruption, which creates this incredibly deadly, escalating tension.
And this tension eventually reaches its boiling point when one of his own 12 disciples, Judas, agrees to turn him over to the authorities. The price for this world-altering betrayal? Just 30 silver coins. If you translate that to modern currency, Judas essentially sold out Jesus for roughly $200. No way, right? It's kind of mind-blowing.
This betrayal triggers the climax of the entire narrative. On day 1 of this final sequence, Jesus is subjected to a rapid-fire trial, beaten, and sentenced to death by Roman crucifixion. After 6 agonizing hours on the cross, he dies. But then, day 3 arrives, and the foundational claim of all Christianity occurs. He resurrects from the dead. According to the historical documents, he spends time with his disciples before ascending into the heavens on day 40. This specific sequence of events causes his followers to relentlessly spread his teachings, which ends up exploding Christianity across the Roman Empire and cementing him as the most influential figure in human history.
Okay, let's move to part 5 and see how this builds into our modern world. 3 ways to coexist and solving the societal clash.
Because whether you view that incredible narrative we just went through as literal history or as total myth, you cannot deny that it shaped the world. Entire wars have been fought over it. So how does modern humanity actually deal with these deeply entrenched, competing absolute truths? Well, the source material outlines 3 options we have as a society. Option 1, we just mind our business. You believe what you want, I'll believe what I want. But as we talked about earlier, this fails the absolute second a societal law contradicts someone's absolute belief. Option 2, going full science mode. We decide that if we can't test in a lab, it's just not real. But enforcing that means actively erasing deeply held cultural traditions, which, historically speaking, leads to severe conflict and violence. So that leaves us with option 3, humility. This requires acknowledging that absolute truth probably does exist, but freely admitting that no single human being has the complete, perfect picture of it. It requires living in this really uncomfortable space of tolerating each other without losing our own internal convictions. But as the source frankly points out, humanity has historically struggled immensely with humility.
So what does this all mean? Ultimately, the debate over Jesus isn't just about what happened 2,000 years ago. It's a mirror reflecting exactly how we handle truth today. Everyone has a truth they refuse to let go of. So as you look at the incredibly complex, divided world around us, the ultimate question remains: whose truth gets to shape the history of the world we live in? Thanks so much for joining me for this